Okay, welcome everybody. My name's Luke and it's great to have you here or have you watching. I'm Anglican and coordinating chaplain here. I'm a Church of England priest and my interest in mental health and faith, I mean the faith part comes from what I do for a job and how I live my life, but the mental health part comes from two different things really. It's from working for churches and now in chaplaincy and journeying with other people through their mental health struggles, and it's also from personal experience. So actually my wife's had quite a long journey with anxiety and panic attacks, and I've had a front row seat to that, and I had moments of mental health struggle myself, even in childhood. It was never diagnosed, but I was struggling with what I would now call intrusive thoughts, possibly had OCD at one point. And as an adult, I'd describe it as sort of blips of depression, sort of micro depressions for maybe 2 or 3 days, a couple of times a year. And that's become fairly normal to me. And this is Leigh.
Hi, I'm Leigh. I'm the Baptist chaplain on the team here. In terms of my personal experience of mental health, I was diagnosed with depression shortly after my 12th birthday. That was the beginning of what turned out to be a 6-month period in which I became practically housebound. In my early teens, I experienced a brief but intense period of OCD focused on repeated hand washing. Then when I was 19, I left university to avoid a mental health crisis, what I feared would be my second Great Depression. And in the almost 2 decades since, I've come to realise that I have an underlying anxiety disorder, possibly related to undiagnosed neurodiversity. And I'm constantly learning how to manage that better. I also, similar to Luke, will have experience of walking alongside others in my role as a Baptist minister.
So hopefully that shows a little bit about where we're at in our own lives and why we care about this and why we wanted to do an event like this today. We're Christian chaplains, and so there'll be times today where we speak more from our personal faith because we're speaking from our personal experience and we can't detach those two things. But we're also hoping that this will be accessible, transferable to people of all faiths or none, people who believe different things to us, who live life quite differently to us, that you'll still be able to access and find useful things that we're talking about today.
So we've already shared that we are people of faith that have struggled with mental health, but is that common? Is it okay? Luke, do you want to say a little on that?
Yeah, so we think this is really important to start on this, that we think it is okay to be a person of faith and struggle with mental health. And that's important to say because actually sometimes there's a perception that faith communities won't think that's okay or won't understand or won't recognise mental health difficulties. And sometimes that's true, sometimes that is the case, that faith communities still carry this sort of stigma around mental health or perhaps around medication. So it's really important to say that that's not where we're at, through our own experience and where we're at with our beliefs. We don't have a stigma on mental health, and we also aren't the kind of religious people that think that the medication is bad. We would not speak against doctors or prescriptions. We would not speak against antidepressant medication when that's what people need sometimes. I also believe in miraculous healing. I've seen that happen. I've seen people's depression lift in an instant. But I'm not the kind of Christian that says we just have to toughen up and be strong mentally, or we just pray and that's all. No, I think actually the way that people are healed most often is through medicine and through doctors and through medication. So that's quite important to say near the start. But also actually I think it's okay to struggle with mental health and be a person of faith because of what I see in my scriptures. When I read my scriptures and reflect on that, I'm encouraged actually that there's a bunch of people struggling like me in there. There's a bunch of people that feel weak and find things hard, and that's okay. So the Psalms are the poetry of the Hebrew and the Jewish and Christian scriptures. And those poems, there's 150 of them, and about a third are what we call Psalms of disorientation. So they're poems of what we call lament, which is where somebody is crying out to their God, going, what's going on? Where are you? I don't understand. And that stuff makes it in. Like that makes it in to the scriptures. It's not edited out. So I draw a lot of comfort from that. And also from stories of individuals struggling with what we would look at and in modern language say that's mental health. There's a guy, a prophet in the scriptures called Elijah, who actually after a great success, like after a great triumph, he runs away and hides in a cave because basically he's got what we now call burnout, and that's okay. And his God meets him there and meets him in that. You got some other examples?
Yeah, I've also turned to scripture to try and understand what faith means for mental health and vice versa. Of course, it's impossible to diagnose people from a handful of ancient writings, but it's always seemed to me very likely that Paul, one of the early church leaders who wrote a lot of the letters that are in the New Testament, struggled with some form of mental illness. He seems to describe something which sounds a lot like depression, and he also seems to have periods of mania. He writes in one of his letters about a thorn in the flesh which tormented him, but consoled himself that God's power was made perfect in his weakness. And while it's not certain that he was talking about mental illness there, it does seem a possibility. And so many of us find solidarity and encouragement in his words. If Paul could find grace in his suffering, then so can we. I also find it really helpful to look to the example of Jesus. I don't see anything in the Gospels to suggest he was a chronic sufferer, but we do see him weep at the tomb of his friend and feel despair to the point of death on the night that he's arrested. The incarnation, the belief that God became flesh and lived among us in the person of Jesus, is the centre point of my faith. And it's deeply significant to me to recognise in him that all of our darker and harder emotions are parts of being human. They might not feel okay, but it is okay to feel them. And if they don't make us less than the incarnate God, then they certainly don't make us less than anyone or anything else.
Yeah, that helps me as well, something about the humanity of Jesus, who is the God that I worship. And the shortest verse in the Bible that says Jesus wept. And I've always kind of thought, all right, if he can weep, then so can I, and that must be okay. So the second thing we wanted to look at really is how can practicing faith or spirituality actually help? So if you're here or you're watching this from a different faith perspective to ours, you'll have perhaps different stories in your scriptures of individuals who struggle. But what we're moving on to now is less about what we believe and more about the practice thereof. How can that help? For me, in the last few years, I've been really helped by what we call contemplative practices or forms of contemplative prayer, which really all has a lot to do with slowing, slowing down, which makes sense because we live in the busiest, most fast-paced culture there has ever been anywhere, ever. So these things are more powerful than ever. And actually, if you've ever come across mindfulness, that's an example of this kind of contemplative stuff. It's sort of a secularized example of that, with the sort of religious bit taken out, I suppose. But actually, there's all these traditions and all these tools passed down through the centuries in different religious traditions for that kind of slowing and that presence to the moment. And there's an overlap between a lot of them. So Buddhist and Hindu meditation has similarities with a lot of contemplative Christianity around things like deep breathing. It's almost like different faith traditions have stumbled across some of the same things that works. Obviously the belief systems are very different, significantly different, but some of the practice is similar. Deep breathing, modern science would tell us, is really, really good for us. on a level that's physical as much as spiritual. So it has to do with the nervous system, the blood-brain barrier, and that sort of thing. So anything that is kind of slowing us down can be really helpful with mental health. What have you found helpful with?
So one thing I've found really helpful is the examen, which comes from the Ignatian tradition of spirituality, which is a thread within Catholicism. It's also known as the prayer of consciousness, which may sound quite fancy, but it's simply a way of reviewing the day in the presence of God. So I find somewhere I can be quiet and comfortable. I ask God to guide my thoughts, and then I look back over the day, asking what has been hard and what has brought joy. And then I ask for the strength and the grace I need for the coming day. Sometimes I think incoherent sentences, sometimes I just hold my feelings before God. But I always find it settles my spirits. And even if prayer isn't your usual practice, you can adapt this pattern and approach it as reflection rather than prayer. I also think Sabbath is really important. That will mean different things depending on your religion, your tradition. But in essence, it's about keeping a day a week as a day of rest, a day that's not like the other days. Sometimes think of it as a day for being rather than doing. For me, it's a faithful practice rooted in the scriptures and traditions of my religion, but I also think it's a very necessary practice for everyone. I say that because I'm not very good at it, and so I know how much I struggle without it. Life is really busy, and it's easy for work and commitments to spill over into every corner of our lives. But I believe Sabbath is a gift given to us by God, because we need it to refresh our hearts and our bodies and our souls. And thinking of which, the Jewish and Christian traditions teach that we are to love God with all our heart and body and soul. And I think it's helpful to think of loving ourselves in the same way. By that I mean practicing self-care, doing things that nourish and nurture every part of us. My New Year's resolution this year was to remember every day to make my bed, take my vitamins, and read for pleasure. They're such tiny things, but they are deeply meaningful. And for me, that means they're also deeply spiritual. I often think of Elijah, who Luke mentioned earlier. When he was at the end of his strength, God told him to have a snack and take a nap. And that says to me that self-care can be an expression of God's love for us. So Leigh, you've already spoken a little about contemplative practices. Can you say a little bit more about what you've found helpful?
Yeah, I was just thinking about how practical that is. Have a nap and a snack. The way that sometimes it's not super spiritual, it's very practical. And on the exam which she talked about, I've read modern psychiatrists saying that this is really good for your brain, and so that's compatible for you if you have a different faith to me or to Leigh, or no faith at all. And I think it's something similar with the self-care stuff. The faith that I follow is about self-denial, but that doesn't mean that it's not about self-care. Actually, someone told me fairly recently, self-care and self-denial are both part of living out your faith, Luke. But self-indulgence and self-abuse are not. I think that's important because sometimes people of faith can kind of burn themselves out with sort of doing all this stuff for other people or for their gods, and actually that healthy tension between self-denial and self-care can be a good thing, particularly when we're thinking about mental health. So our limits, different people have different limits, and that's okay. And also the things we do that sort of feed the soul. So a lot of my spiritual disciplines, the things I do because I'm a Christian, are things that involve making some effort, but they're also making some effort to feed my soul. I'd include in that exercise. So sometimes we get this idea that the spiritual and the mental and the physical are these detached, compartmentalized things. I don't think that's true, and I don't think my scriptures present that as the truth. I think there's an integration. You mentioned that commandment to, how did you say it? Love God with
heart and body and soul.
Heart, body and soul. And so for me, for the last few years, since lockdown really, I went from doing no exercise at all and being really, really unfit, despite always being skinny, to actually running and getting fit. I'm not an amazing athlete, not a proper runner, but I run 2 or 3 times a week, play a really low standard of football about once a week, and I count that as spiritual discipline, and I do it for my mental health as much as my physical health. If I get injured or I get lazy, that affects my mental health. And so it's that linking between faith, my mental health, and the physical aspect as well. A couple of other little things I found helpful. One is the practice of journaling. So there's some pretty convincing studies that suggest that people who journal, who write, and actually not type, but physically write or draw, getting the thoughts and the stuff from the head out through the body onto paper, that's quite a powerfully helpful and healing practice. So that's become part of my practice. And then returning to those contemplative disciplines, so a couple of those. So breath prayer is a form of prayer where you just repeat a phrase. I guess in other faiths sometimes it would be called a mantra. Within Christianity it's just breath prayer. There's a phrase or a verse of scripture. For me it will be something that I consider to be God's truth about me or about him, or one of his names or titles, or something that I'm praying for, where instead of having to find all these different words, I can repeat the one word whilst I'm walking somewhere, whilst I'm chopping vegetables or washing dishes or folding clothes or running around the park. And that repetition on my out breath is powerful and helpful. And the other one would be what's called welcoming prayer, which is a little bit like in mindfulness, this idea of you slow down enough to notice, you notice what you're feeling, you notice what your body's carrying, and then you don't judge that thing. That's the crucial point, is you notice without casting judgment on it. Hello panic, I notice you're there, I'm not going to judge you, and then you kind of do the whole thing again and let it go. It sounds like it shouldn't work, but in my experience, it's really, really helpful, that sense of welcoming what is instead of judging it. And from a faith perspective, sitting with my God, who I believe is a good God who loves me, in whatever that is.
Brilliant, thank you, Luke. Now we want to make sure we leave time for questions and conversation, so we'll start drawing things to a close now. But we want to end with some final reflections on what faith can offer in the face of mental health struggles.
Yeah, and this is the point where we really are only qualified to speak from our own faith. So there's been points throughout this where I've tried to mention other faiths that friends of mine have, or the position of people with no faith. This bit is really where we'll be more specific and unique from our experience as Christians, I suppose. And so Leigh, what you've mentioned at the start, your own mental health battle. What is it about your personal faith that speaks into that in a way that helps you?
So I think one of the greatest things my faith offers me is hope. And for me, that's a hope founded on the promise of resurrection. When Jesus walked out of the grave, he declared there is always life and joy and peace on the other side of pain and sorrow and despair. I believe we'll find the fulfillment of those things in eternity, in whatever comes beyond this present reality, but I also believe we get glimmers of them here and now. And I don't just believe that because others have told me it, or because it's a nice idea, but because it's been my experience. I have suffered, and I have flourished, and I have known God in all of it. My anxiety may not be cured in this lifetime, and I can't be certain that depression or OCD won't rear their ugly heads again. But with grit and with grace, I can manage my mental health. I can know life and joy and peace in spite of it, and I will know greater life and joy and peace on the other side of it. And that hope sustains me. Luke, how about you?
I don't know if I can top that. That was amazing. But what my faith speaks to me when it comes to mental health really is about a God who gets it, a God who suffers with. Sometimes people say to me, or I say to God, well, where are you in this? Where is God in this? And when I'm answering that question, part of me wants to say, I don't know, because there is no answer for suffering. But then a part of the answer is, where is God? He's right there with you. He's right there alongside you. For me, it makes a difference to be worshipping a God who himself has suffered. And I think that might be unique to Christianity amongst major faiths. I don't worship a God who's distant and detached. I don't follow someone who's alone and aloof. I have a God in Jesus who has become human and been through what we go through. And that makes all the difference in the world to me. The idea that he has been born as a baby, that's the Christmas story. He's died a brutal, torturous death, that's the Easter story, and he's been through everything in between. And so when I cry out to him, I know that he gets it, because he's actually walked that road. And that's actually what the word chaplain means, to walk alongside as well, to journey alongside. So that's what we're here and our colleagues are here to do in this university for students and staff, is to walk alongside, journey with, through all of the stuff, and that includes mental health. And so that's some of the ways that my personal faith makes a difference to me in the midst of all of that. So what we're going to do now is we'll move on to Q&A. So we're going to start the recording at this point. Just before we do that, Leigh, you want to just signposting other resources and places that people can turn?
Yeah. So if you are struggling with issues around mental health, or you know people who are, there is support out there. No one needs to go through it alone. So we at the chaplaincy are here to listen, to walk alongside, as Luke says. And the wellbeing team, as part of student services, can refer on to more formal counselling. Away from the university, your GP can help you access mental health services and treatments. And you can call 111 for urgent support, or 999 if you're at the point of needing immediate medical assistance. And organisations like Samaritans and Mind run helplines and have resources and advice online. So please do make use of any or all of that.
Brilliant. So thanks so much for being here today. If you're watching later online, then I hope this has been helpful to you. Please do feel free to get in touch. And if you're here in the room, we're about to switch off the recording now. We'll take your questions and do our best to answer them.